Hello everyone. Today I thought I would fulfill a request that I got from a viewer, I believe in Europe, who was asking me to do another Atlas talk, specifically about the United States and the different regions of the United States. So I found an atlas that is not quite so old to use, and I thought what I would do is go over kind of the general map of the United States, and then in some of the other pages further back it talks about the specific regions of the country. This map here does not include Alaska or Hawaii. It is only of the contiguous states that are touching each other. Alaska and Hawaii are further on in the book. Okay? So this is a map of the contiguous United States. The country is broken up into a few basic geographic regions. They are the eastern seaboard, the Gulf Coast, all around the Gulf of Mexico. You have the Appalachian Mountains, which stretch all the way up from Maine all the way down into Georgia, like this. Starting to the west of the Appalachian Mountains is called the Central Plain area, generally in this area here. And that gives way to this area of the country, which is known as the Great Plains. Then we come to another mountain range, which is known as the Rocky Mountains. And they stretch all the way from Canada, coming all the way down through into Texas. You then have the area here on this side, which is not quite as high as the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains are actually just this ridge here. And it gives way into an area known as the Intermountain area. And that's broken up into several plateaus. And then finally we have the Pacific seaboard. And that is broken up into the very top area here, which is called the Cascades, and this area down here, which is called the Sierra Nevada. So that is generally the large geographic divisions of the country. The plains gradually rise up from being only a few hundred feet above sea level at the Mississippi to being over a mile high in Colorado, just as you get to the Rocky Mountains. So quite a change in elevation, but it is gradual. And most of these areas here are very flat and get progressively more hilly as you move this way towards the Appalachians. Specifically in this area, even though this is technically part of the plains, it is quite hilly and the ground is full of small valleys and rolling hills. But generally nothing that you would consider a mountain. But it's not flat. It's rolling hills here. The part that's very flat is out here in this part of the country. The two main mountain ranges of the United States, the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, are quite different from each other. The Rocky Mountains are much more your traditional mountain range. When you think of mountains, the high, desolate, craggy rocks sticking up above the tree line, capped with snow, those are the type of mountains you're talking about here. The Appalachian Mountains are much older, and so they have been worn away to a much greater extent. And so they never get above the tree line. So they are completely covered in forest and greenery. And there's many different little streams running through them. And that's one of the reasons they get their nickname, which is the Smoky Mountains, particularly in this southern area of the Appalachians, is called the Smoky Mountains. And that is because the fog that forms over the streams and is trapped by the trees in the morning, the mountains appear to be smoking sometimes, as the mist from the moisture clings to the hillsides. And it's quite beautiful. But the Appalachian Mountains are much more heavily populated than the Rocky Mountains are, for obvious reasons. The people here live mostly around the bottom of the mountains because this mountain range is too high to support a permanent human dwelling among its higher peaks. But the Appalachian Mountains have a culture kind of all of their own, as small rural towns sprung up all around the hills and mountains of Appalachia. And speaking of that, you can talk about the different cultures that exist within this country. It is so big that it holds several distinct pockets of culture, and those pockets have changed even throughout history. One of them being the culture of the Appalachian Mountains, traditionally thought as being very rural and poor, but there is also a lot of lore and knowledge and wisdom that was passed down from the Indians who used to live here that is still remembered and practiced in the Appalachians, even to this day. And so even though things like coal mining and things like that have left this area in pretty bad shape financially, there is a very rich cultural heritage that exists in these mountains that I think largely goes unnoticed in many areas of the country. The traditional South of America usually runs this way from Texas all the way over to the Carolinas, and from Virginia and Tennessee over this way is generally considered the South when you talk about the culture of the South. When you talk about the Deep South, you're usually talking about Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Would be considered the Deep South, where you have much more of the deep Southern accent and what you would traditionally consider Southern culture. Texas is kind of a blend between the Southern culture and the culture of the West, with cowboys and oil and many of the things that you don't necessarily find over in this part of the South. Much of the area here in the South, in this fertile, flat area, in the beginning of our country's history, was used for planting crops such as cotton and rice and indigo and tobacco. And throughout the history, those crops changed and rotated as they became more or less profitable, switching from one to the other throughout time. And because of that, you had a lot of plantations that used slave labor to harvest those crops. Moving up into this area, the northeastern part of the country, we have names of cities that are very familiar to anyone who has studied the founding of our country. We have Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and of course Washington, D.C. This area is very mountainous. We have the Appalachian mountain chain still continuing up through here. It is rural as well in many areas. Many small farms, many immigrants from Europe came and settled here. And so you will often have pockets of different nationalities that you can tell by their last names, whether they be Dutch or German or Irish or many of the other cultures that immigrated across and landed here in this area and then spread out in successive waves, pushing ever more to the west. But lots of little farms still exist here in these mountains. Then moving across the Appalachian Mountains, we have the beginnings of the Central Plain section of the United States. Many of the cities here are known for their heavy industry, such as Chicago and Detroit. Massive rail cars brought in steel from outside the state and the cities. And in this area, a lot of the Industrial Revolution really caught hold. And these cities grew very, very quickly and produced massive amounts of goods which were shipped all over the world. Even as far down as such as Cincinnati and some of the other towns around this area were heavily involved in the manufacturing of all different types of goods. And then moving out here into the Central Plain area, we have large flat expanses of prairie at one point in time, and now is devoted to growing crops on a massive scale. Huge flat areas that can be easily cultivated, growing corn and all different types of other crops that easily grow in those environments. And then we have the Rocky Mountains, which we've talked about. A lot of tourism here, a lot of skiing and hiking. Moving on into the plateau areas or the intermountain areas of the country, where basically the Rocky Mountains slope back down to this coast, but not as dramatic as they rose on this side. And they just seem to spring out of the plains, this wall, all the way down the middle of the country, rising up out of the great flatness that is the Great Plains. And then finally we have here on the Pacific coast, we have California and Oregon and Washington. A very different climate than you find here. A lot of the area in this here is desert, is dry and arid, and not a lot grows here. But then you get closer to the Pacific coast and the country turns lush and green again. And you have the huge redwoods up in this area of the country where you have a lot of wet, humid climate from the moisture coming off of the ocean. Very similar to the weather patterns in England. The warm ocean currents come up and keep this area of the country warmer than it would normally be from a purely geographic standpoint. So, a lot of rain and a lot of lush, wet foliage. So there's a lot of rain in this area, and Seattle in particular is known as a city where it is always raining. Much of the same reputation as England does. And then moving on down, we have California, and we have wine country, and we have a lot of very fertile land here as well that can grow citrus trees and many other different crops. So very similar to Florida over here in this area. And Florida is unusual, even though it is in the southern part of the United States, and the northern part of Florida is definitely part of the Deep South. The southern part of Florida is a very much mixed area of the country, with many people moving from the north and either vacationing here or retiring here, and other people coming from all over the country to live here. Very similar to a lot of the things that happen in California as far as migration and moving to these warmer areas of the country. So even though it's geographically located in the South, culturally it's very different from the South, with Hispanic influences coming up from the South through Miami, and a lot of tourism and a lot of retirement people living here. Florida wasn't really settled heavily until the middle of the 20th century, primarily because air conditioning was not fully available until then, and so the population was fairly sparse. With the advent of air conditioning, the population of Florida really took off, where people could live in the heat and the humidity that weren't necessarily used to it from other parts of the country. Okay, so what I thought I'd do next is flip through some of the next pages in this atlas, which cover specific regions of the country. And even though this atlas hasn't broken them down by the areas in which we just talked about, they broke them down much more by which states they could easily fit together on the page and get them as large as possible. But I thought I'd just go through and read some of the captions that they have around talking about each one of these regions. So the first one is called the Northeastern States, and that includes Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So here we see, even up into Canada, it is labeled the Appalachian Mountains. Here it says, the principal seaboard cities grew up on trade and manufacturing. They are now global centers of commerce and corporate administration, dominating the regional economy. Research and development facilities support an expanding electronics and communications sector throughout the region. Pharmaceuticals and chemical industries are important in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The marshy lowlands of the Atlantic coastal plain dwindle towards the north, giving way to the rocky coast of Maine. Uplifted over 4 million years ago, the Appalachian Mountains have since been carved into several discrete ranges by the region's main rivers and heavily denuded by successive glacial advances. This broad upland belt with the younger Adirondack Mountains is bound by the Great Lakes in the northwest. So basically you have the mountain range here, which is split by these rivers that run through and divide the mountains up from a north to south direction. Next we have the Mid-Eastern states, which they list as West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And here we have more of the Appalachian Mountains coming through. The eastern tributaries of the Mississippi River drain the interior lowlands. The Cumberland Plateau and the parallel ranges of the Appalachians have been successfully uplifted and eroded over time, with the eastern side reduced to a series of foothills known as the Piedmont. The broad coastal plains gradually falls away into salt marshes, lagoons, and offshore bars, broken by flooded estuaries along the shores of the Atlantic. So this is known as the Piedmont area here between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachians. It starts out very close to sea level and rises slowly through the Piedmont area, which is generally hilly, but just kind of rolling hills, up into the actual Appalachian Mountains. And this is actually, when you get here, it's a fairly rapid incline as well. You have these lowlands, or these foothills, that are fairly gradual, and then when you hit the mountain ranges, especially if you're driving along one of these highways, it just starts to climb very quickly up into the Appalachians. Large areas of fertile soil and a mild climate support the largest output of tobacco in the U.S. and a broad range of vegetables, as well as soybeans, peanuts, corn, and small grains. The Kentucky bluegrass around Lexington is a major horse and cattle rearing region, and poultry is important in the North and South Carolina. Cotton, South Carolina's traditional crop, has declined significantly, but remains important in western Tennessee. Forestry is widespread in the upland areas. And here we have the southern states, which are Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. The Blue Ridge Mountains in the north are skirted by the gentle hills of the Piedmont, whose rivers drain south into the great flat expanses of the coastal plain. Sandy barrier beaches and islands dominate the seashore, tracing round the swampy limestone arm of Florida. In the west, the Mississippi meanders towards its delta, crossing the thickly mantled alluvian plains of the interior lowlands. So here we have the Appalachian Mountains are petering out into just some basic hills, and the water is draining from them into this large fertile area here. And then we have, of course, the great Mississippi River, which is draining all of the country from up here, and all the water flowing down into the huge delta here in Louisiana. The area in Florida, the land is very, very sandy, and the water does not stay in the soil for very long. In fact, when it rains, even very heavily, within a day or two, the ground has dried out very quickly. And that's one of the reasons why ever so often you will hear that there are lots of fires here in Florida, because it doesn't take much before this area can dry out, and then any kind of spark can start a fire. And Texas is so big that it gets its own double-page spread. A very, very large area. The second largest state, only to Alaska. Texas is made up of a series of massive steps descending from the mountains and high plains of the west and northwest to the coastal lowlands of the southeast. Many of the state's borders are delineated by water. The Rio Grande flows from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf of Mexico, marking its border with Mexico. So this is the Rio Grande River that flows this way into the Gulf of Mexico. Next we have the South Midwestern states, which are Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Most of the region consists of high, treeless plains, which gradually descend east from the Rocky Mountains. Drainage follows this slope, with rivers flowing towards the alluvial lowlands of the Mississippi in the southeast. Between the plain and the lowlands lie various ranges of wooded hills, including the deeply incised Ozark Plateau. So mostly you have the beginnings of the Great Plains here, moving into the Mississippi Valley area here, with the Missouri River running down towards the Mississippi through Kansas City and into St. Louis. And you have here's the Ozark Plateau. So you have a slight bit of a mountainous region here compared to the flatness in this area. And these are the upper plain states, which are North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Iowa. These states straddle the Great Plains and the lowlands of the central U.S., with Minnesota lying in the transition zone between the eastern forest and the prairies. The region was shaped by repeated ice advances and retreats, leaving a flat relief broken only by the numerous lakes and broad rivers that network and drain the prairies. So basically, the ice ages, with the glaciers repeatedly coming in and going out, have worn this area smooth, just like a stone. The Great Lakes states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Much of this region shows the impact of glaciation, which lasted until about 10,000 years ago and extended as far south as Illinois and Ohio. Although the relief of the region slopes towards the Great Lakes, because the ice sheets blocked northerly drainage, most of the rivers today flow southward, forming part of the massive Mississippi-Missouri drainage basin. So here we have the Ohio River, which is a massively huge river that drains into the Mississippi, and many other smaller rivers that feed into it as well. Here we have the northern mountain states: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Minerals and timber are extremely important in this region. Uranium, precious metals, copper, and coal are all mined, the later in vast open-cast pits in Wyoming. Oil and natural gas are extracted further north. Manufacturing, notably related to the aerospace and electronics industries, is important in western cities. So you can tell the color of the map has dramatically changed in this area. Many more grays and browns, with only a little bit of green here on the western side. And this is just called California and Nevada, which is California and Nevada. The broad Central Valley divides California's coastal mountains from the Sierra Nevada. The San Andreas Fault, running between much of the state, is the site of frequent earth tremors and sometimes more serious earthquakes. East of the Sierra Nevada, the landscape is characterized by the basin and range typography, with stony deserts and many salt lakes. So here we have a very craggy desert environment where many of the lakes do not have adequate drainage, so they evaporate and are very brackish and salty. Here we have, this is called Death Valley, going into the Mojave Desert. The South Mountain States, which are Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. The arid rocky expanse of the Colorado Plateau is dissected by immense canyons of the Colorado River. Desert lies to the north and south, and branches of the Rocky Mountains run east and west. The Great Salt Lake and desert lie within the Great Basin, a barren region of parallel mountain ranges that extend into Arizona. Denver here in Colorado, right at the base of the Rocky Mountains. And Denver itself is an elevation of about a mile high above sea level. And when you're here, especially if you've lived somewhere that is closer to sea level, you have to be careful because the elevation is so dramatically different from where you may have been used to living, that oftentimes you'll feel lightheaded and easily winded even though you're just walking a short distance, because the air is so much thinner and there's that much less oxygen available. And here we have Hawaii and Alaska. Very different climates in very different states. Alaska is the largest state that we have, and Hawaii is one of the smaller ones. Talking about Hawaii here, the volcanic soils are extremely fertile in the climate hot and humid on the lower slopes, supporting large commercial plantations growing sugarcane, bananas, pineapples, and other tropical fruits, as well as nursery plants and flowers. Some land is given to pasture, particularly for beef and dairy cattle. And then Alaska. The mountains of the Pacific coast culminate in the heavily glaciated Alaska Range and extend west to the Alaska Peninsula and the great volcanic arch of the Aleutian Islands. The interior plains are drained by the Yukon River and bounded by the bare, jagged peaks of the Brooks Range to the north. And the next is Mexico. So that finishes our tour of the United States. I hope you found it informative and interesting and relaxing. Thank you for watching, and thank you for subscribing. I have many more videos to come, and please give me any suggestions you might have for something you'd like to see in the future. Thank you very much. Bye.